of Obstetrics and Gynecology, KFOG, and he has got to his credit many awards. So if we go on reading the awards, I think it will take another 15-20 minutes. And he's very good speaker, and he has got many other qualities also. So Shizes will be talking today on, I think, vaginal birth after cesarean and the previous cesarean. So over to Dr. Shizes, and after your talk, let us have some comments from other co-chairpersons. So Dr. Shizes here. Okay.
Thank you so much, Vidya Madam. Such a pleasure to be introduced by you. Such a privilege to be here today. Is my screen visible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Lovely to be the opening batsman for the day 2 of this wonderful national e-conference on labor that is being conducted by KBC Medical College at Surya. Thank you so much, Geeta Madam, for this invite and making me a part of this lovely 2-day program which attempts to unravel the mystery behind problems related to labor. And big thanks to the head of the institution, Dr. Neelambige, as well as the organizing secretaries, Dr. Ravi Kant and Dr. Bhavya, and to the entire team.
He is more bothered about that Bima Center, no?
Which I can see on the brochure. So big thanks for making me a part of this lovely, lovely program. So let me just get on with my lecture. Now, this is the topic for the day. TOLAC versus planned repeat cesarean delivery. For people who are not used to this terminology, TOLAC is trial of labor after a cesarean section. And obviously planned repeat cesarean is something which you all know. Now, this is a debate which has been going on for long. And I would say that it's a never-ending debate. And it is good to debate because every year when we talk about this, we come out with something new. We come out with some better evidences, which actually helps the clinician in you makes a better decision. So let the debate be never ending. Let this be a very hotly debated topic ever. And hopefully we can make some good decisions on the mode of delivery for such a patient with good scientific discussions. Now, I've always felt that in a conference or a webinar, when people talk about this topic of how to choose the mode of delivery in a post-cesarean pregnancy, there are primarily 2 schools of thought. The first school of thought comes from the minority, but they are the speakers at conferences, people including me, who are relatively experienced. They are generally very skillful, some evidence-based individuals, but many of these senior people who actually talk about the evidence, most of them have the luxury of a big team in a tertiary care center. The other voice comes from the majority, which is the logically thinking obstetricians working in single consultant hospitals in the big or small towns of the country. Okay, now, which one do I belong to? I would say I neither belong to either of them because there is a glitch here. I would undeniably say that the most important thing, irrespective of how much ever we talk about evidence and science, the most undeniable thing is the logic of the obstetrician working in the periphery. And the best decision is the one taken by him or her based upon the available resources that he or she has got in the work setting which he is a part of. So let's get on. We're talking about a scenario where there is a post-cesarean pregnancy and we want to choose and give her options about mode of delivery. We have 2 options primarily. One is about going into labor and attempting for a vaginal birth, which is what we call as trial of labor after cesarean or TOLAC, or she could have a planned repeat cesarean delivery. Whenever we are recruiting a patient for a planned TOLAC, It could either result in labor and end up in a vaginal birth, which is what we call as VBAC, or she could end up in an unplanned intrapartum emergency cesarean section. So remember that TOLAC is not the same as VBAC, and a VBAC is one of the outcomes of a planned TOLAC. I would say a successful outcome of a planned TOLAC, the other outcome being an unplanned emergency cesarean delivery. So we have a planned TOLAC group, a repeat cesarean group. Planned TOLAC could end up in two of the outcomes, either a successful vaginal birth where we call it a VBAC, or an unplanned intrapartum cesarean delivery. When it comes to the decision making, there are a few factors which obviously you need to consider. In these days of increasing medical legal problems, patients' personal preferences are given a very, very important value. Number two is the obstetric history of the patient, which are the factors related to the previous cesarean, as well as her comorbid factors now in this pregnancy, which helps you to choose your patient for VBAC well or choose your patient for TOLAC well. You should be talking about the data of the risks and benefits of TOLAC versus a planned repeat cesarean, and most importantly, whether the availability of TOLAC in the selected birth setting wherever you're working, including the anesthetic facilities and the ability to take up for a cesarean section immediately as you have made a decision. Fine. For the patient, it's primarily two major concerns. There are two questions which she would ask you whenever you give these options. One is, what are my chances of a successful VBAC? And your answer should be anywhere between 60 and 80%. Second question is, what are my chances of a scar rupture? You should tell her that on an average, it is between 0.4 to 0.7%. So 60 to 80%, 0.4 to 0.7%, the two answers which the patient would seek, and you should be able to tell it very clearly. Now, medicine these days is a game between benefit versus risk, isn't it? And the medical and the obstetrical benefits of TOLAC are primarily the avoidance of the risks of a repeat cesarean. And you know that these risks are primarily related to the number of cesareans that she has undergone. More number of cesareans, more is the risk. Yes, I am talking about additions, which could involve the bladder, the bowel, with a definite inherent risk of ending up in a visceral injury, difficulties even to enter the peritoneal cavity, difficulties to deliver the baby, and a whole lot of problems. Sometimes it is so very difficult and a nightmare to even enter these abdomens. So the risks of multiple cesareans are significant. Now, coming on to the other aspect, which is the medical and the obstetrical benefits of a planned repeat cesarean, are primarily about avoiding the potential adverse outcomes of a trial of labor, isn't it? You know that there is an increased risk of postoperative wound infection related to an unplanned intrapartum cesarean due to a failed TOLAC, possibility of postpartum endometritis, a small but a definite risk of scar rupture. As you go on, remember that benefits of TOLAC, that is trial of labor after cesarean, are very closely related to having a successful vaginal birth. That means you need to choose your patients well. Why am I saying that? I'm saying that because the morbidity levels for the mother are least when the patient ends up with a successful VBAC. The morbidity levels are moderate in a planned repeat cesarean group. And most importantly, the morbidity levels for the mother are maximum when she plans for a TOLAC and ends up in an unplanned intrapartum emergency cesarean section. So this is why I say that you need to choose your patients well, so that you almost always end up, almost 60 to 80% chances of ending up in a successful VBAC is there. That is how well you need to choose your patients. Where does the evidence come from? 2010 guidelines on National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. They sat together and looked at all the available evidence related to TOLAC. Their primary aim was to make recommendations for practitioners so that they can decide on the right mode of delivery. Before we actually get on with what the evidence said, you should always understand the limitations of these evidences. Number one, no large randomized trials are available to compare a TOLAC data versus a planned repeat cesarean group. Very important. Number two, there was a systematic review which actually identified 2 randomized trials but involved only a total of around 320 women. with very minimal data on maternal and infant clinical outcomes. So whatever two randomized trial we had very less number of patients as well as very minimal data on maternal and infant outcomes. There were many case control and cohort studies which have reported good amount of maternal and neonatal outcome data. But the problem was they were based on the actual route of delivery rather than the intended route of delivery. You know what I mean? A patient was kept for TOLAC. That means a trial of labor, okay? And she delivers by a cesarean section. So her data was calculated along with the planned repeat cesarean group. A patient was kept for planned repeat cesarean. She ends up in a vaginal birth. She goes into labor and ends up in a vaginal birth. Her data was tabulated along with the vaginal birth group, and that creates a lot of bias. And number 4, very important, women actually did not want to go through the randomization process to choose their mode of delivery. So they did not want to be a part of the trial. So that's why randomized trials were very less. And because of the lack of intent and the inability for many women to go through the randomization process, they had to step in with another strategy called propensity analysis. Propensity analysis is a statistical method in an attempt to replace randomization. Though I say it can replace randomization, it does not replace it very well, but it is the best available alternative that we have. So most of the evidence that talks about TOLAC versus planned repeat cesarean is based on propensity analysis rather than on randomized trials. So what does the data say? For the mother, the rates of endometritis and operative injury are lower for the planned repeat cesarean group. For the baby, the incidence of respiratory distress syndrome and newborn infection rates were lower in the planned repeat cesarean group. The rates of hysterectomy and wound complication rates were obviously higher in the planned repeat cesarean group. If you want it in very, very simple numbers, I would say that the authors estimated that almost 62 women would have to go through a planned repeat cesarean to prevent one maternal adverse outcome of TOLAC. And 43 women will have to go through a planned repeat cesarean to avoid one neonatal adverse outcome of TOLAC. So these are numbers which can help you in counseling. 62 cesareans to avoid one abnormal maternal adverse outcome, 43 cesareans to avoid one adverse neonatal outcome. If you look at scar rupture and look at a hypothetical group of almost 1 lakh women of any gestational age who goes through TOLAC, there would be around 468 uterine ruptures. Simple words, 1 in 200 TOLACs may end up in a uterine or a scar rupture. On the other hand, people who are kept for a planned repeat cesarean, 1 lakh women, there were incidentally some 26 uterine ruptures. That means 1 in 4,000 planned repeat cesareans may encounter a uterine rupture. So that numbers can tell you the comparison. 1 in 200, 1 in 4,000. Okay. 62 cesareans to avoid a bad maternal outcome. 43 cesareans to avoid one neonatal adverse outcome. These numbers can really help you in counseling. Now, the other outcomes of a uterine rupture is the possibility of ending up in a hysterectomy, possibility of ending up in a perinatal birth. But thankfully, there are no maternal deaths reported. That means, in simple terms, scar rupture may lead to the death of the baby, and morbidity for the mother. But mortality for the mother generally does not happen because an intervention generally happens before that. If you look at the infection rates, the overall rates of infection are similar for both TOLAC as well as PRCD. But remember that VBAC, the successful outcome of a planned TOLAC, has the lowest frequency of postpartum infection when compared to a planned repeat cesarean. And at the other hand, the unplanned intrapartum cesarean delivery has the highest frequency of postpartum infection. Again, telling you that you have to choose your patients well. Peripartum hysterectomies are primarily done for uterine rupture in cases of TOLAC and for adherent placenta for patients who were posted for a planned repeat cesarean. People talk about pelvic floor disorders, especially in days of women empowerment. People are worried about their pelvic floor and they feel that if they undergo a cesarean section, they can avoid all the potential risk and sequelae of pelvic trauma and pelvic relaxation disorders related to labor and childbirth. But remember to tell them that the absolute benefit of planned repeat cesarean versus vaginal to prevent pelvic floor dysfunction is still unclear, and add on to the fact that Pregnancy itself is a risk factor for future pelvic relaxation disorders. So just by doing a cesarean, that does not keep your pelvis intact and prevent pelvic relaxation. You getting pregnant itself can be a risk factor for future pelvic relaxation disorders. Now, many a times there are so many reasons why women choose for a repeat cesarean or a vaginal delivery. But convenience becomes a very, very important factor these days. And as you all would agree, the benefit of a planned repeat cesarean is that of a scheduled delivery. It allows her and her family the ability to make very specific work-life plans for delivery and postpartum period, which you would all agree, and we need to respect that, because most of the present generation mothers definitely require help from someone else to bring up their baby. Especially if they're working, there's no need to further underline that fact. Now, remember, you might argue that even in TOLAC, you can plan your induction and make it predictable. But remember the golden rule that the best success for a planned TOLAC comes when the labor is spontaneous and not when we induce. So you should take it that PRCD is going to be more predictable and TOLAC is going to be a little bit unpredictable. Now, personal benefits which people say about VBAC would be a shorter hospital stay and quicker return to normal activities. But I'm sure many obstetricians would oppose to that and would say that they can discharge their patient on second day or third day after a cesarean section also, and hence can actually help them achieve and get back to normal return even after a planned cesarean if it is indicated. Now, postpartum sterilization is a very, very minor point in support of cesarean delivery, and you should not actually entertain it because there are good contraceptive methods and there is very easy way of doing a lab sterilization, even as a daycare procedure. Even for patients who have delivered vaginally, you can do it later on at the end of 6 weeks or so. Coming on to perinatal morbidity and mortality, these rates obviously are higher for TOLAC when compared to a VRCD. These are the numbers of perinatal mortality rate and neonatal mortality rate. But remember, though we talk about these numbers, the absolute risk of the baby ending up in a problem is actually very low, even with TOLAC. Now comes the use of bag and mask ventilation and TTN. Very important aspects. As you would expect, the use of neonatal bag and mask ventilation was more in babies delivered by vaginal route, that is TOLAC, than by babies delivered by cesarean. But remember this point called transient tachypnea of newborn. Okay, that was found to be more for babies who were delivered by cesarean section. Now, why does transient tachypnea happen? Transient tachypnea happens because of retained lung fluid. Okay, because of retained lung fluid. Whenever the baby delivers vaginally, prior to vaginal delivery, there is a cortisol surge in the body. And that cortisol surge helps in reabsorption of all the retained lung fluid from the baby's lungs. Okay, so the baby comes out of a vaginal delivery with the least amount of retained lung fluid, and that is why the baby delivered vaginally ends up with very less amount of TTN. But for the baby planned for a repeat cesarean, you take out the baby so very fast, baby has lot of retained lung fluid and ends up in ICU, probably just for this entity called TTN. So incidence of TTN is significantly higher for babies delivered by a cesarean section. Now, is there a way to modify your cesareans to reduce the incidence of TTN? Then I would honestly advise you to have a look at this technique. Now, this is named after me. It's called the Scheid's technique of cesarean section. And fortunately, we could make it appear in the British Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology in the year 2011 with our case series. Now, a very, very simple technique. The basic difference is I use uterine contractions to deliver the baby rather than me pulling out or pushing out the baby. Okay. So immediately after giving spinal and the patient is kept in the dorsal position, I start an oxytocin infusion. 5 international units at 32 drops per minute equates to around 18 to 20 milli international units per minute. 5 units oxytocin, 32 drops per minute. Make the uterus contract. By the time you open your abdomen, reach the uterine cavity or the uterus would be very actively contracting. You make the incision and the baby would actually come out just with the help of the uterine contraction. So this is a technique where the uterus would push out the baby for you rather than the anesthetist or you yourself giving very bad fundal pressure. Okay, now just look at this. Fine. So after giving the uterine incision, just lift the baby's head and allow the baby a surface to slide on. Palmar surface of your index and middle fingers provides the area to slide. Very clearly note that there is no fundal pressure. Anesthetist is also admiring your way of delivering the baby from the leg end. And the uterus is contracting and pushing out the baby for you. Okay, that's how easily the head can come out. This was a previous 4th cesarean after previous 3 cesareans. Okay, 4th post-cesarean pregnancy after previous 3 cesareans. Okay, now the advantage of this particular technique is that the uterus hugs upon the baby's chest, squeezes out the lung fluid much better. So incidence of TTN can significantly be reduced, and that is one significant benefit. Okay, now if I can pause it here, as I told, we found that in our case series, the incidence of TTN was almost nil, because here was a contracting uterus hugging upon the baby's chest and squeezing out the lung fluid through the oral and the nasal cavity. So the retained lung fluid obviously was less. That was the benefit for the baby. Benefit for the obstetrician obviously is no fundal pressure and very easy delivery. No more non-engaged heads. All heads are engaged because you have already made the uterus to contract and push out the baby. And number 3, for the mother, it is almost 50 to 60% reduction in the blood loss at a cesarean section, because you are working on a uterus which is already contracted. Okay, fine. So just continue looking at it. After delivering the head, you just have to lift up the baby, allow the uterus to contract and expel out the baby by itself. Now just see how beautifully the uterus can help you deliver the baby rather than you pulling out the baby. That is what you see generally. See that there is no action at the anesthetist end. Okay, no fundal pressure. Nobody sitting across the patient's chest and pushing out the baby for you. This is otherwise known as the baby's walkout technique. Baby would kick the uterus back and come out of the uterus comfortably and so actively. And at this point, also note that the placenta is here, almost very clearly seen, almost separated by now. And by the time you finish your cord clamping and get back to the site, you will see the placenta would also come out by itself. Okay, so that's how it is. Now, these are some of the data which I've already mentioned. And before I finish, let us look at why women choose for one mode of delivery over the other. Okay, now most common reasons for women to choose a TOLAC are: one are for those women who have future pregnancy plans. They know that multiple cesareans would increase their risk of adherent placenta and also placenta previa. So they don't want to go through that. Many have family obligations, want to get back to a normal routine very fast, and they feel vaginal route is actually the best possible way for that to happen. Number 3 is the desire to have a vaginal birth. And trust me, even women of this present generation want to experience a vaginal birth. She was robbed of her opportunity for some reasons in the first pregnancy, and she doesn't want that to happen again. So she wants to go through a TOLAC. Number 4 is the desire to get her partner involved in labor and childbirth. Okay, because that cannot happen probably with a cesarean. And in vaginal delivery nowadays, partners are allowed in most labor rooms, I believe, and that's the way to get her partner in. Now, why women choose for PRCD? Most important is scheduling convenience. It's a predictable mode of delivery. You can fix up the time and day and ensure that you get enough amount of help whenever you require. Women didn't want to go. Women had fear of a trial of labor, and they told the obstetricians that I may have to suffer the pains of labor, and then if I end up in a cesarean section, I have to bear the pain of a cesarean section also, as well as the post-operative discomfort. So they didn't want to go through those twin pains. Some women were so afraid of labor pain, so they wanted to totally avoid it, so went for PRCD. And women also claim that sterilization can be done together. So that's why I prefer a planned repeat cesarean. Now, the take-home messages are very simple. One is for the mother, the rates of endometritis and operative injury are least with a planned repeat cesarean. For the baby, incidence of respiratory distress syndrome and newborn infections were lower with the PRCD when compared to a TOLAC. VBAC obviously has a lower frequency of postpartum infection than PRCD, but remember that an unplanned intrapartum cesarean section has the highest frequency of infection, so choose your patients well. Rates of hysterectomy and wound complication rates were higher with PRCD. Remember the numbers. Chance of scar rupture after TOLAC is 0.4 to 0.7%. 1 in 200 TOLACs can end up in a scar rupture. 60 to 80% of well-chosen patients can end up in a successful vaginal birth. But finally, knowing all the signs, make the logical decision with scientific knowledge based upon the availability of resources at your particular setting. and what comes out after the discussion with the patient and the bystanders. So the logic of the obstetrician working in the peripheral center is undeniable. He is the boss, and his discussion with the patient and the bystanders with sound scientific knowledge of all this data that I've mentioned should be the best way to decide the mode of delivery after a cesarean section. I hope I've been able to convey my message. Thank you so much for a very, very patient listening and for tuning in on this good Sunday morning to listen to this talk on mode of delivery after a cesarean section. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Shaizas. It was a wonderful talk, and your Shaizas technique is very popular amongst many of the obstetricians. And I think I remember long ago you had sent me that video, and I have tried on 1 or 2 patients, but many times what happens in fetal distress, we cannot use your technique. That's it. But otherwise, it is very good technique, and it prevents, it acts as an active management of 3rd stage of labor like that also. So it prevents lot of bleeding as well. So it was a wonderful talk. And as you told that it is always a obstetrician's dilemmas and it is always a patient's decision. And cesarean deliveries on maternal request and the urban areas, they are very common. We always find that we cannot have that WHO standards and we cannot keep up at 15% rates. But as an obstetrician, we always try to counsel the patients, and many times it may not be possible. We have to have a Caesar audit in every institution so that we look into what is going wrong and where we are going wrong. So in COVID areas, of course, the cesarean rates are skyrocket high. But even then, I feel that we should judge it very carefully. I want any comments from my co-chairperson, Dr. Kasturi, who has also joined in. And there are no questions in chat box because I think it was the first session. But if you stay back, Shaizas, if you're free.
Yeah, there are questions, ma'am.
There are some questions. And Geeta
there are
is there.
questions. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I
Kasturi
did not
ma'am.
see, but you can, Geeta, you can take over.
Yeah. Kasturi ma'am.
Yeah. Excellent talk, Shajish, as usual. Or every time he comes out with a very, I feel like he's a very innovative person. Not only in academics, in all other things. I am a good friend of him, and I know he's a very multi-talented and multifaceted person.
Thank you so much.
Excellent. Regarding just one point, so that people follow that, regarding your technique of Shaij's technique, that into 5 units of intestinal, we have done a good number of cases, and we have presented paper also on that. This was after I heard you talk in, I think, one conference in Bijapur. And excellent. We have done a number of cases. I'll tell you, TTN is very less, as you told. And then extraction is so easy, it's like playing. You need not worry. You are not dependent on the anesthetist and all to push all that. I think everybody should follow his technique. It's really, except for those some contraindications, you can rule out that, and all other cases you can do. As you told, all are engaged only. And as all of us know that when a patient in labor and when a elective, the difference in baby outcome and also the extraction, so many, all those benefits you will get when you employ your technique in a planned system. One more thing, just I wanted, regarding hysterectomy, when we go give them Tolec, do you all routinely take consent that they may end up in hysterectomy?
Basically speaking, there are 2 ways of looking at it. One is these are high-risk patients who might actually end up in a hysterectomy as a life-saving procedure. So rather than leaving it all to a situation where there is panic and then somebody has to emergently, in an emergent way, run out of the OT, meet the bystanders, tell that the situation is very panicky, and now you give a consent, it is always much better to inform them prior about the possibility and tell them very clearly that the risks of ending up in a hysterectomy are actually very less. But for the sake of the procedure, for the risks involved, you need to make it a part of the consent making whenever you take up a patient for a TOLAC or for probably a planned repeat cesarean also, because incidence of adherence is increasing. Because it's not just about uterine rupture. I think adherent placenta is becoming really, really significant now. And unfortunately, even today, many are getting missed in the ultrasound scans that are done during pregnancy, and many are being found out for the first time at the on table. So I think put together all these risks, it is much safer for us to take that consent for a hysterectomy as part of the consent for a cesarean section.
Yes, even I totally agree with this, because we have faced a situation. Once I remember some few years back, the patient was allergic to TOLAC, and then because of certain rupture, she was shifted to OT, and on table she ruptured, and it was very bad rupture. And patient attenders gathered outside, and they told, we are not going to give consent for hysterectomy. At any cost, we want the uterus. And our assistant in the middle of the night, she called me, madam, they're telling at any cost they want the uterus. They're not going to give consent for hysterectomy. So I rushed to the OT, somehow retained the uterus with great difficulty, though she had some broad ligament hematoma. So much. With great difficulty, we retained the uterus because the patient attenders never, because they told, you never told us, So
The only point, madam, is that for a life-saving purpose, even if you actually do a hysterectomy without a consent, also it can still be argued upon in the court of law. But this situation where patient with a post-cesarean pregnancy is being taken up for a TOLAC or a PRCD, a consent for hysterectomy is a must prior to that.
Thank you. It was really very excellent, and I request everyone to adopt his technique. At least you start adopting. Excellent, because it's my experience, own experience.
Okay, we have a question here from Dr. Megha. Any specification in consent for repeat planned C-section? Any important points in consent for TOLAC?
Basically, I think we probably should be consent should be, what do you say, two important components. One, if you're planning for a TOLAC, obviously it should include the consent. I mean, the facts about scar rupture, which you already mentioned, and the associated comorbidity, the consequences of a scar rupture of ending up in a hysterectomy, and even problems related to the baby. The other aspect is for a planned repeat cesarean, we obviously need to talk about adherence. And all adherence may not be picked up in an ultrasound, so you might actually have to anticipate the surprise finding of an adherent placenta on table, the possibilities of adhesions involving the bladder and the bowel, the possibility of visceral injuries that can happen during a planned repeat cesarean. So all those components need to be included.
I'm listening.
Thank you, sir, for the excellent presentation.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We move on to the next speaker. Okay. Now the next speaker for the day is Dr. Sarita Agarwal. She'll be talking on overviewing of various birthing positions. Dr. Sarita Agarwal will be introduced by our chairpersons.
Okay,
Welcome, Sarita. Welcome.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
okay, I'll introduce. Okay.
You introduce. Kasturi.
Dr. Sarita Agarwal is a very well-known personality. I don't think so she needs much introduction. She has worked a lot in FOXI and ICOG. Presently, she is a professor and head of the Department of OBG at AIIMS Raipur. And she has served as Vice President FOXI 2015, ICOG Governing Council member and chairperson of HIV Committee. And she has done so much of work under when she was a chairperson of HIV Committee, and she has brought out many guidelines during her period. And she has organized more than 30 sensitization workshops on HIV and AIDS all over the country, and 15 basic laparoscopy workshops as Vice President FOXI. And she is involved in many research activities with ICMR and many others. And she has achieved so much, but I'll not take much time. Now I request Dr. Sarita Agarwal to talk on birthing positions, the various, the overview. Actually, this is a little neglected topic. So we are looking forward to hear to this birthing position, because in India we don't give much importance to that. Over to you, Dr. Sarita. Okay, mute.
Yeah. Very good morning to one and all. And thank you for this kind word. And I thank Dr. Geeta for giving this opportunity to me. And I don't know how she came to know about me. And the topic allotted to me is like a very good topic and very practical topic. So I love to share this topic, that is alternate birthing position overview. And when we talk about the alternate birthing position, why we talk about? Because the labor is considered as the most dangerous journey of a woman ever undertaken. And it is the worst journey in the world as defined by Apsley Cherry et al. In 1922. And everyone deemed the obstetrician and the mother both that at the end of the delivery, the mother should be healthy and the baby should be healthy. And further, now the concept of respectful maternity care, which is especially stressed out upon the 7 rights of the women, which I don't, every postgraduate must know. These are the 7 rights of the women. And one of such right is choices and preferences, that we should respect the women's choice, what she wants. And among these choices, the one choice is the right to have a liberty to move during labor. She has a right to choose to have a companion, either can be the husband or can be the birth companion. And the one most important is the right to choose the position for the childbirth. And providing due care for the emotional needs and the comfort is the responsibility of every midwife or the obstetrician taking care of a woman during the labor. So when you talk about the right to choose the position of the birth position, you can just have a case in the medico legal also in 2016. The Caroline Malestita won a landmark court case in Alabama when she has sued the hospital that the hospital nurse forcibly turned her onto her back during her delivery, and the hospital was awarded a penalty of $16 million because the forcing of the women into care providers preferred position is being described as an obstetric violence. We are lucky that in our country we don't have such cases till now, but with this is one which is the women's right. Therefore, the concept of alternate birthing position needs to be understood by each and every postgraduate, and the maternity leave maternity ward it should be implemented. The most traditional position used by almost 80% of the hospital in India now is the lying on the back, maybe dorsal position, maybe recumbent position, semi-recommended, or the lithotomy position, which is the most popular position. Why actually we prefer this position? I think the PGs are not allowed to speak. Otherwise, I would have asked how many have heard about the alternate birthing position and how many have they practiced it. It comes to be very few. In the US also, this was discussed in the medical school, and none of the students were aware about the alternate birthing position. And this is the most important reason that why the traditional birthing position is being preferred. Our postgraduates are not being trained enough in the other alternate position. They have been, the part of the curriculum is a standard traditional position of lying on the back or the lithotomy position. And of course, it is the most comfortable and most convenient to the care provider. It is easier for the caretaker to look at the abdomen, look for the fetal heart rate when the mother is lying on the back. If you want to give an epidural, again, the epidural procedures, after the epidural position, patient lies on the back and finds her comfortable. But when you go for the upright position, patient will not be able to stand alone, or there will be risk, so she may need an extra assistant. And the hospital may have limitation for the caregivers, and the less number of caregivers can be there. Further, if you want to carry out the instrumental delivery or the vaginal birth, it is much easier in the back on back position. And of course, if you want to inspect the perineum, it is easier to do it in the traditional back position. But just look at, if you want to take out the catcher from this bottle, would you like to keep the bottle like this, lying? Of course, no, because the gravity doesn't work. And the same happens when you're delivering the patient on the back position. You miss the gravity of the gravity effects on the pushing, and because of that, the labor may be prolonged. Further, on back position, the gravid uterus presses on the aorta and the inferior vena cava, and thereby decreases the fetal circulation and increases the risk of fetal hypoxia. Further, the alignment of the uterine axis and the pelvic axis is not as efficient as in the upright position. Therefore, the efficacy of contraction is less. Further, the researchers have also found that the back position or the supine position of delivery increases the risk for postpartum urinary incontinence, specifically the stress urinary incontinence. So, considering all these facts, the alternative birthing position definitely has certain advantages, and how there are the several physiological reasons which I described were not available when the woman is delivering the supine position. That is the upright position. Gravity is there, which helps in the bringing of the baby, and therefore it can shorten the duration of labor. There's less risk of compressing the mother's aorta, and therefore the better oxygen supply to the baby, and the heart rate variation may be less when the patient is delivering in the upright position. Similarly, the uterus contracts more strongly or more efficiently and help the baby to get in the better position to pass through the pelvis. Apart from that, the MRI has shown the dimensions of the pelvic outlet becomes much wider in squatting and the kneeling position, all four position, which is very well studied by the Gupta et al. In 2017. And further, if you look at the maternal satisfaction score in the various studies, it leads to be more positive birth experience for the women who deliver in the alternate birthing position. There are the Cochrane reviews also, which shows that the shorter duration of labor by 29%, and there's a risk of emergency cesarean section is reduced, 21% reduction in the episiotomy rate. There's a reduced need for the epidural and also the analgesics during the labor. And based upon this, most of the maternal position other than the supine position have shown to have the potential benefits in promoting the optimal maternal and the fetal outcome. So what are these positions? The positions are typically classified in two ways. One is the upright position or in the non-upright position. I will be taking all these positions one by one in detail. The other way of classification is the flexible sacrum position that takes the weight off the tailbone. And second is the non-flexible sacrum position where the mother's weight lies on the tailbone. Now you can just understand, we very well know that the patient goes in the second stage of the labor. When the sacrum goes back, the outlet diameter increases by 2 centimeter. And the sacrum forward, the diameter is 11 centimeter. When the sacrum goes back, the anteroposterior diameter is 13 centimeter. So now you can think which position can be better, either the backline position or the upright position. So the position that takes the weight off the sacrum allows the pelvis to expand and ease the delivery of the patient. So coming to the first position, that is the upright position. In the upright position, the woman is standing. She may be walking. She may be swaying. Simply, she should be in vertical position. While she is swaying, she can take the support of the husband or she can take the support of the birth companion. And that gives the most comfort to the patient during the woman during the labor. Therefore, the advantage of all the upright position is there, that it can encourage the baby to move deeper into the birth canal with the effect of the gravity. The contractions are more efficient and the back pain is less. The partner can massage her back when she is standing. All methods have some disadvantage like that. The upright position, the disadvantage, the women with a high blood pressure cannot be allowed in the upright position, and a telemetry unit may be needed for the continuous monitoring if you need a high risk pregnancy. And another most dangerous is the women remain unattended, then the risk of baby falling down is there. Therefore, this position demands for a continuous presence of one healthcare provider or the nursing or the partner to be there when patient is laboring. The second position is a squatting position. When the mother, I think this is a position used in the rural areas long back. The patient just sits on the toilet seat and then she delivers the baby. And the easier deliveries, easier births are there. The pain is less, and therefore most of the time the women use this position when she's late in the labor or during the labor, maybe the early stage. She can intermittently sit down in the squatting position, and this can be the partner sitting on a chair can give the support, or she can be just hanging on a birthing bar, and then she can give her the squatting position, or she can take the support of a chair and sit in the squatting position. So the squatting position has several advantages. It definitely helps in widening the pelvis and then give more room for the delivery of the baby. But the disadvantage, sitting in the squatting position may be a difficult on the mother's part, and it can become tiring if she sits for the longer time. So the intermittently, this position is being used by many mothers during the labor. Then the sitting on a cushioned birthing chair with a U-cut. This is quite commonly practiced in many of the centers. And here this is, you can see that ordinary chair can be cut like that in the U-cut, and the patient can sit. It should be well cushioned. So the patient should not have a pressure effect when she is sitting on this chair. When she is sitting on the chair, she can rock backward and forward, and that helps in relieving the pain. And similarly, the husband sitting on the back can give a back massage, or the birth companion give her the back massage. So this is one good position. The squatting position advantage is there because in the sitting position also, the pelvis is being opened up. The advantage of upright position, that the gravity works over here, and the patient is sitting, the fetal monitor can be very well applied. So the problem is not there in this patient, and it is much comfortable for the women to deliver in a U-cut chair with the delivery. Now look at this birthing ball, which is a common gym ball available anywhere. This chair balls can be kept in the labor room, and the mother can lean forward like this and rest in between. And when she is about to deliver, she can just sit on this ball, and the obstetrician sitting over here can deliver the baby with the wide end of the leg. So the birthing ball position again is very comfortable for the women, but of course one support system is needed. So she should be able to make the balance. Then there's a special type of stools are being designed, which is called the birthing stool position. Again, these birthing stools have the U-cut, and this U-cut can help the delivery. The woman can sit on the widened leg, and the obstetrician sits here like this, and the patient can be delivering. And when she is not in the active pushing effect of the second stage of the labor, she can just relax herself by leaning on the table, this birthing stool, or just putting one leg supported over this stool, and then she can deliver very well. And this table can be kept used for the water birth also. And water birth time, this can be put on the water tub, and this can be again used. So it has an advantage of both sitting and the squatting position. So it has an advantage of sitting and a squatting position both. Now this is the lunging position, the most commonly taught thing on the gym. Just one leg is forward with the knee bent and the lying flat. So here it is not a classical gym position. Here what the woman does, she just put her leg over a stool or the chair with the knee bent and the flat. And then when there is a contraction, she just leans forward and then goes back. Leans forward and goes back. And this way she can have a relaxation, and the pain during the labor may be much less perceived with the women in this lunging position. And all the advantages of upright position is also there. Here again, you need a partner or the birth companion to help us during the labor. Now coming to the sideline position, this is slight modification of the standard supine position, where the woman lies on her side, and when she is not actually laboring, she can just put a pillow between these two legs. But when she labors, she has to widen the leg, and the obstetrician sitting by the side can deliver the patient. The advantage of this position is that the mother is lying on not on the back, so the pressure of the aorta and IVC is not there, so better fetal circulation is there, and therefore the heart rate variation may be less, and the indication for cesarean section is less when the patient is lying comfortably on the back lying and the lateral lying position. And again, the back massage can be given, and it is easier method to relax during the contraction. I'll suggest all the PGs when they are delivering the patient, when the patient is not on the active second stage of the labor, till she comes to this stage, she should be made comfortable on lying either on the left lateral position or on the right lateral position, which gives the maximum comfort to the women. So this is the side lying position. Now this is the all four position. We are all are taught in the shoulder dystocia management. The women lies on the knees and the arms, and that helps the women to deliver the patient, but because it widens the pelvis and it helps provide more space in the pelvis during the delivery. And this has been taught when you're delivering the shoulder dystocia. So in this position, again, you have the advantage of the upright position as well as the advantage of a sitting position. The only problem with this position is that when you're there for the, when the woman is there for the longer time on her arms, she may be feeling tired. So intermittent hand and knees position may be there, or at the time actually when she is delivering, and the second stage, this all four position is quite useful. Reclining position, again, very commonly used. The head of the woman is raised, but it has got the disadvantage of all the supine position, because you are just now aortic pressure is there, but the patient is quite comfortable in this position as well. Now the most awaited topic for all the postgraduate, what is the water birth? I think water birth or the hydro birth, it is now quite old, and even in the India, in the few centers, this facility is available where the women gives the birth on the tub of the lukewarm water. Why it is useful? It is said when the baby is delivering, it comes out from the water tub. It is just like, and the baby feels the environment is exactly same as the amniotic sac, and the baby is quite comfortable. Then when your patient is on the water tub, the delivering method can be two. One is the hands-off technique and the hands-on technique. In the hands-off technique, the obstetrician or the midwife sitting doesn't do anything. Just the baby comes out at its natural method, as Dr. Saizas was talking about during the this VBAC also. You don't have to put much effort. The baby comes out, takes its own speed of delivery. Even the mother herself can help the delivering of the baby. So the obstetrician's hands are off. In the hands-on technique, the obstetrician help the delivery of the baby by to stop the spontaneous rapid birth of the baby. Now this can be a choice when which method to be used, which method to be practiced, the hands-off technique or the hands-on technique. Now comes how you're going to monitor the patient when she's in the bathtub. So the specially designed waterproof continuous monitors are also available in some of the hospitals, and this can be used. Otherwise, intermittent auscultation is sufficient, and I think it is a low risk women. The intermittent auscultation had lots of advantage, and the continuous fetal monitoring itself posed the increased risk of cesarean section. We all are aware about that thing. The water bath has definitely a certain benefits. It increases the woman's energy. The buoyancy effect lessens the mother's body weight and allowing movement and the new positioning. The buoyancy effect further promotes the efficient uterine contraction, and it also improves the fetal blood circulation. Therefore, the more oxygen to the baby. It reduces the stress, how the pain is being relieved in the water bath. It reduces the stress-related hormone and therefore allows the release of the endorphin, and which actually works as a pain inhibitor. Perineum also becomes more elastic and relaxed, reducing the incidence and severity of tearing. So there are so many advantages which has been very well elaborated in many trials, including the Cochrane review, and they found that the women who are in the water bath, the need for the analgesia, the need for the epidural is much less. The duration of first stage is less than average by 32 minutes. Even there is some study where describe the duration of second stage is also significantly reduced when the woman is laboring in the water bath. But of course, there are certain risks with the water bath. That is, the theoretical risk of water embolism is there, but it has been rarely noticed. The British Medical Journal says there can be a risk of aspiration of the water by the baby, but if you look at the logically, the baby doesn't breathe till it acquires the air. So when the baby is delivering in the water tub, till it is being exposed to air, it is not going to get the aspiration of the fluid. So there, another concern is that the umbilical cord could snap if the baby floats in the water and come onto the surface, but this is again a very rare evidence. There are certain contraindications for the water birth, the maternal infection like genital herpes, breast presentation, and the excessive bleeding, the multifetal pregnancy, the preterm labor, and the preeclampsia patient. The water birth is usually not indicated. Now you may be asking, after so many positions, which labor position is the best? My dear postgraduate student, there is a little evidence that any one position is the best position. No one position needs to be mandated or prescribed as per the ACOG. The overall observational study says the women spontaneously assume many different positions during the course of the labor, and the many of the observational study has shown the women in the first stage and the early second stage of the labor, they resume some other position, and then at the time of the birth, many obstetricians prefer that the patient should be in the back lying position only, so that gives them comfortable, because this has been taught in the literature and they are not very well prepared about how to deliver when the patient is standing, sitting, or in the squatting position. So the frequent position change enhances maternal comfort, and optimal positioning can be supported with the appropriate maternal care. I just came across to learn about the three stages in the second stage of the labor when I just looking the literature says that the second stage is further divided into the passive phase, the active phase, and the actual birth phase. So during the passive phase, actually the head is descending and it is rotating and there's no bearing down effort. In the active phase, actually the patient starts perceiving the bearing down effort, and it is also known as the reflex phase. And then the third stage is an actual birth. So if one can understand this concept, the patient can still be resting when she is in the passive stage, and only during the active stage, when there's a desire for the pushing, the patient should be allowed to push, and that is going to provide the maximum relaxation to the women during the birth process. So I think this all concept has been very well supported by many of the evidences, the Cochrane trial, the meta-analysis. I'm just not reading all this trial. If anybody wants to read, then they can just go through the evidence-based birth, and you can get this data of the alternate birthing positions very well supported, the comparison of the non-upright position and the upright position. The comparison is also available for the squatting position versus lying back lying position, and there are the n number of literature for the water birth is also available. So just to end up my talk, the certain take-home message is that the alternate birthing position gives the women positive birth experience and has got lots of physiological benefit. Each method has its own advantages and disadvantages. Therefore, one has to look for this, and one has to be very much trained about this and understand which women should be allowed in which, but the patient's comfort is most important, and the prior counseling of the women definitely help us which position she is going to opt. And if she's aware of the various positions during the labor, she can choose which position makes her more comfortable. And given the evidence and the ethical guidelines, it is being shown by, it has been dictated by WHO in 1996, the Royal College of Midwives, the Royal College of ACNM, that is the American College of Nursing and the Midwife. They have given the clear guideline that the medical schools and the residency program should begin training medical students and resident physicians that how to support women in the various birthing positions. So they should not have an apprehension at the end, as they have not been trained about the alternate birthing position, which are much better than the standard backline position. So this is very important. The curriculum should include the alternate birthing position. And my lecture is over. I just want to get an excuse to start with my one video. Can I just take one video? How to go for the sharing of the video? I want to minimize. How to minimize this presentation?
On your laptop only, Sarita.
Mm,
Minimize it.
I'm not getting to minimize. I just want to, I'll just stop
Ma'am,
sharing.
double click on the screen. Double click on
Yeah.
the screen, ma'am.
Okay, but if still no.
Video is not playing, I think, no? After double
I
click.
just, no. I'm just stopping my sharing and then coming back to share my screen with the video open.
Yes, ma'am, that will do.
My screen, can you see my video?
No, ma'am.
Yeah, I got it.
Ma'am, you may have to go back to Zoom.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's coming.
it's coming, no?
Yeah.
So I have to yeah. So I just want to show a video on the alternate birthing position. What happened? This everything is
Y'all don't mute me. I will control my own muting and unmuting. Ma'am, we are not able to see the video.
Yeah. We are not able to see the video. In the meanwhile, she uploads the video. Dr. Geeta, can we take some of the questions? Can you read from the chat box? I think Dr. Ravi.
I think she is logged out, ma'am. She must be able to hear us. I think she is logged off and she's playing the video.
Okay.
My mobile. Take this. Just try.
Yes, madam. Yeah. Hello, madam. Okay. Okay. You want to log in later, madam?
Few questions are there.
हो गया
Wait for me or
उससे ज्यादा अच्छा होता है, ज्यादा अच्छा होता है.
Questions are there.
okay. Thank you.
What happened? Dr. Sarita has logged out. Huh?
Network issue is there. She has asked to start with the next speaker, and after that she'll take our questions.
Okay, no problem.
With the next speaker.
So can we have the next speaker, please?
Yes, Dr. Chandrasekhar Murthy, our next speaker. I request our chairpersons to introduce our next speaker.
Yeah. Can I have his CV, please? Yeah. So, yeah. So, welcome Dr. Chandrasekhar Murthy, who is a consultant urogynecologist and head of the department of OBGYS Hospital, Peenya. He is presently chairman of Scientific Committee of Urogynecology, Kasoga, Karnataka State of Obstetrics and Gynecological Association, and he has conducted many live operative workshops at state as well as national level as a faculty. He has got many publications in 4th and national one and international journals, and he has presented many national and state conferences. So Dr. Chandrasekhar Murthy is very well-known urogynecologist, we all know. And now today he will be speaking on OASIS, that is And third and fourth perineal tears, what are the implications and how to manage them? So over to Dr. Chandrasekhar Murthy. Welcome, sir.
Hello.
Hello.
You can
Yeah.
start, Chandra.
Thank you for your kind.
You have to unmute, Chandru.
Madam. Share वो करना है.
So we have Dr. Chandrasekhar Murthy, sir, who will be talking on OSS, 3rd and 4th degree tests. After this session, we'll take the questions from Dr. Sarita ma'am.
Thank you for your kind words, madam. At the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Geeta madam for giving me this opportunity. And I want to congratulate them for conducting this e-conference on labor and birth. So my topic for today's presentation is third and fourth degree perineal tears management. Madam, is it coming?
Your screen is not shared.
It is shared, madam.
We are not able to see your slides, sir.
Yeah, we are not able to see your slides.
Okay, 1 second, madam. So, share. Zoom go. One second, madam. Share. Desktop ಹೋಗ್ತದೆ ನಮ್ದು. ನಮ್ಮ desktop ಹೋಗೋದು. Desktop ಅಲ್ಲಿ presentation ಹೋಗ್ಬಿಡ್ತೇನೆ.
So our speaker is sharing his screen. Yeah, we are able to see your slides.
Banta?
Now we are able to see, Chandru.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes, we are able to see now. Slides, so you have to make. Okay.
Yeah, the rate of anal sphincter injuries has tripled from 2000 to 2012. In England, it was 1.8 in 2000, whereas it is 5.9 in 2012. So the overall incidence in UK is 2.29. Compared to multipare, the incidence is high in primipare. The reason for increased incidence from 2000 to 2012 is not mainly because of increase in the rate of injuries. It is increased because of recognition. The rate of recognition has been increased from 2000 to 2012. So then what are the risk factors for this anal sphincter injuries? Asian ethnicity, nulliparity, birth weight more than 4 kg, shoulder dystocia, occipito-posterior position, prolonged second stage of labor. They are the actual risk factors. And with respect to the instrumental delivery, Ventouse without episiotomy has got more risk in comparison to Ventouse with episiotomy. Likewise, even for forceps with episiotomy has got less incidence of anal sphincter injury in comparison to forceps without episiotomy. So these are few images of identification of injury to the sphincters. So this is the internal anal sphincter. This is the external anal sphincter. We are holding it. So this is complete. This is 4th degree perineal tear. Can you make out this tear in the rectal mucosa? Yeah. Okay. Then what is the classification? Classification of this perineal tear. So first degree tear is injury to the perineal skin or to the vagina. Second degree tear is injury to perineum involving the perineal muscles but not involving any sphincter. Third degree, in that it is included the sphincter damage. Third A is less than 50% of the external anal sphincter thickness is torn. In third B, more than 50% of the external anal sphincter is torn. Third C is both external anal sphincter and internal anal sphincters have been torn. Fourth degree is injury to the anorectal mucosa along with these damages. So this is the photo showing the degree: first degree, second degree, third degree, and fourth degree. Okay, can this obstetric anal sphincter injury be prevented? Okay, so yes, it can be prevented up to certain, we can minimize this. So how to avoid this? Mediolateral episiotomy should be considered wherever it is necessary. When episiotomy is indicated, the mediolateral technique is recommended with careful attention to ensure the angle of 60 degree. What happens when we give when the head is fully crowned? So when we give episiotomy at 60 degree inclination, after the delivery, the degree will be 40 degree. Like that, when in full crowning, if we give episiotomy in 40 degree, so after the delivery, if we properly assess, the episiotomy angle will be 22 degree. So that is why, while we should not take the consideration of angle at the time of incision, okay, we should take the angle of episiotomy, this thing, post delivery. After the delivery, we should assess. So it should be as per NICE guideline. The episiotomy angle is very, very important to prevent this sphincter injury. It should be between 45 degree to 60 degree. So 45 to 60 degree episiotomy angle should be assessed after delivery, not at the time of giving episiotomy incision. Okay. Then perineal protection. So perineal protection, is it really gives protection for anal sphincter injury? Yes. Hello. Perineal protection at crowning is protective. And warm compression during the second stage of labor, continuous warm compression to the perineum at the second stage, it prevents the risk of obstetric anal sphincter injury. With respect to the perineal protection, there are two concepts. As per NICE guideline, hands on and hands off, there is no much difference. As per Green Prop recommendations, so always it is better to put right hand in the perineum, left hand to support the head, and ask the mother not to push while the head is in crowning stage. These are the precautions to be taken to prevent obstetric anal sphincter injury at the time of delivery. So, repair of obstetric anal sphincter injuries. What are the this thing? So precautions we are supposed to take. All women having vaginal deliveries should be examined systematically, including digital rectal examination to assess severity of damage, particularly prior to the suturing. So that means for all vaginal delivery, rectal examination is must to rule out the sphincteric damages and buttonhole injuries to the rectum. Sometimes what happens, sphincters may be intact after the delivery, but if we properly do rectal examination, we can able to feel some buttonhole injury in the rectum. So if it is identified, it has to be sutured to prevent rectovaginal fistula afterwards and to prevent anal incontinence in the futures. After all vaginal deliveries, rectal examination is must. Okay, next, repair obstetric anal sphincter injuries should be conducted by an appropriate trained clinician or by a trainee under supervision. So it has to be repaired by a trained surgeon. So where the repair should take place? Ideally, it should be done in an operation theater under GA with good lighting and using appropriate instrument. If there is excessive bleeding, then pack the vagina and then take the woman to the theater. So repair of obstetric anal injuries in delivery room, because sometimes it is very difficult to shift all the delivered patients to the OT, we may not get. Sometimes after discussion with the senior obstetrician, we can repair this obstetric anal sphincter injury in delivery room in special circumstances. Okay, what are the techniques of repair? Now we have this anorectal mucosa in this obstetric anal sphincter injuries. This obstetric anal sphincter injuries includes only 3rd degree and 4th degree perineal tear. 1st degree, 2nd degree perineal tears are excluded with this nomenclature. Okay, this torn anorectal mucosa should be repaired, and internal sphincter, external sphincter. These are the things. Okay, how we are supposed to close this anorectal mucosa? It has to be closed. It has to be sutured either with continuous stitch or with interrupted stitch. Okay, wherever internal anal sphincters are can be identified, it is advisable to repair this separately. Okay, in all the cases, it is very difficult to identify internal anal sphincter. Agreed. But in case if we can able to see this, it's better to repair it separately from the external anal sphincter. So how to close it? Whether with interrupted or mattress? Yes, we can do interrupted stitch or mattress. In both these two, we are not supposed to use figure of 8 stitch. So either in the anorectal mucosa or in the internal anal sphincter. So figure of 8 stitch is to be avoided because it is going to hamper the hemostasis. Okay, then what about the external anal sphincter? In external anal sphincter, we may get partial tear or complete thickness tear. So whereas if it is partial thickness, then end-to-end anastomosis is used. Okay, if it is full thickness, 2 options are available: overlapping and end-to-end. In both, there is no problem with the efficacy. Both are equivalent in outcome. So if it is a full thickness external anal sphincter damage, either overlapping technique can be used or end-to-end technique can be used. Whereas for this internal anal sphincter, we are not supposed to use this overlapping technique. Only we are supposed to use end-to-end technique. Okay, for this partial tear, we can use only end-to-end techniques. Okay, so choice of the suture materials. Here we have anorectal mucosa, internal anal sphincter, external anal sphincters. So these are to be repaired. So what are the choice of suture materials? So for closing this anorectal mucosa, we are supposed to use 3-0 Vicryl polyglactin. Okay, so we are not supposed to use PDS for this anorectal mucosa. For anorectal mucosa, 3-0 Vicryl is ideal. When we are repairing external anal sphincter or internal anal sphincter muscles, so preferably PDS, 3-0 PDS or 2-0 Vicryl. Both have got equivalent outcome. So there is no preference. Either we can use 2-0. When we are using Vicryl, it should be 2-0. When we are using PDS, it should be 3-0. So this is with respect to the repair of external anal sphincter and internal anal sphincter. When obstetric anal sphincter repairs are to be done, the knots should be buried beneath the superficial perineal muscles. That is superficial and deep transverse perineal muscle. So between these two muscles, the knot should be buried. Otherwise, there will be a problem of a suture migration. So it will end up with chronic pain and irritation over the anal region. So these are things to be considered. So this is the schematic diagram showing the end-to-end repair of sphincter, external anal sphincter, external anal sphincter. So this is the diagram showing the overlapping technique. So sutures are passed like this. So after this, tie the knots like this. This is the overlapping technique. Once again, I will show. This is the end-to-end closure. So this is how we are supposed to take the stitch. After that, in overlapping the technique of external anal sphincter, we are supposed to tie the knots like this. Okay. What are the post-operative important things that we are supposed to be considered? Okay. The use of broad spectrum antibiotics are recommended following repair of sphincter injury to reduce the post-operative infection and dehiscence. The use of postoperative laxatives is recommended to reduce the risk of wound agents. So bulking agents, Ipsagula, that should not be given routinely after laxatives, okay? Because once we start laxatives along with the this bulking agents, then what happens? The lady will be having diarrhea, incontinence, immediate anal incontinence. That affects the healing procedure. That's why bulking agents should not be used routinely with laxatives. Postoperatively, laxatives and antibiotics. These are the two things to be given. So, and local protocols are different for different areas. Okay, antibiotics, the best sensitive antibiotic in that area should be selected. This is as per Green Top guidelines. Okay, even laxatives, the recommended laxatives which are available in that country, in that area should be used. Examination and follow-up. For this, whoever is the best, whoever is the senior most surgeon in that institute, should do the follow-up and he should take care of the patient. Women should be advised that physiotherapy following the repair is beneficial. So this we should convey the lady. If you want to undergo physiotherapy, yes, it is beneficial, you can go ahead. And when women who have undergone obstetric anal sphincter repair should be reviewed at a convenient time, usually after 12 weeks postpartum. Where possible, review should be done by a clinician who has got special interest with this. Okay, what are the recommended practice? Rectal examination after delivery, adopt the new classification, obstetric anal sphincter injury repair by experienced doctor in theater under regional or general anesthesia, external anal sphincter end-to-end or overlap repair of torn anal sphincter with 20 PDSR Vicryl 20, lactulose 15 ml BD for 2 weeks, antibiotics, ensure bowels opened, follow up at hospital by a senior obstetricians. What is the postnatal review? All women should be offered physiotherapy of pelvic exercise at 6 to 12 weeks. All women who had obstetric anal sphincter repair should be reviewed 6 to 12 weeks postpartum. So when to refer? A lady of obstetric anal sphincter injury, when to refer that case? If a woman is experiencing any incontinence, either for the flatus or for the fecal material, or pain following the surgery, referral should be done to a specialist, gynecologist, or to a colorectal surgeon. But the problem with colorectal surgeons, they are not fully aware of these acute injuries. So we should keep it in mind. Okay, a small number of women may require referral to a colorectal surgeon. That's why where secondary sphincter repair are required. So post-delivery counseling. So how to counsel the patient? Women should be advised that after the surgery, 60 to 80% of the patients will be asymptomatic at 12 months. Most women who remain symptomatic describe incontinence to flatus or fecal urgency. Okay, regarding post-delivery for the next pregnancy, how we should counsel the patient who has undergone sphincter repair in this pregnancy. So, as per Green Top guidelines, all women who sustained an obstetric anal sphincter injury in a previous pregnancy should be counseled about the risk of developing anal incontinence, worsening symptoms with subsequent vaginal delivery. So, subsequent vaginal delivery, there is a possibility of worsening of this anal incontinence symptoms. And all women who sustained an obstetric anal sphincter injury in a previous pregnancy should be advised that there is no evidence to support the role of prophylactic episiotomy in subsequent pregnancy. Okay, this time the lady had developed this thing, obstetric anal injury. So there is no guarantee that in subsequent pregnancy, by just giving prophylactic episiotomy, it can be avoided. So even in future also, the lady, even with episiotomy, the lady can develop obstructed anal sphincter injury. That we should, in the counseling, we should tell this. And all women who have sustained an obstructed anal sphincter injury in a previous pregnancy and who are symptomatic and or have abnormal endoanal ultrasonography findings or manometry should be told that the option of elective cesarean section should be given. That means if the lady is having symptomatic anal incontinence or abnormal findings in endoanal ultrasonography or manometry, they are the people whom the elective cesarean section option should be given. Okay, documentation and information. When a third and fourth degree pairs are performed, it is essential to ensure that anatomical structures involved, method of repair, suture materials used are clearly documented, and instruments, sharps, and swabs are counted. Everything should be recorded in the document, and woman should be fully informed about the nature of her injury and benefit of her follow-up, and she should be told she should not be there at the home. Frequently, if she comes for the follow-up, it is better for her health. So these are all these things should be clearly documented and given to a lady while discharging. So unfortunately, as we all know, this obstructed anal sphincter injuries are acute. I do not have, apart from these pictures, I do not have any video of this, but I have a video of chronic pelvic complete perineal tear repair. If you want to watch the video, it is 5 minutes video I will put. Hello?
You can play the video.
Yeah, this is the video of chronic perineal tear. Now I am separating the vaginal mucosa from the underlying structure. Okay, this is actually 1 to 1.5 hour surgery. I have reduced it to 5 to 6 minutes. So that is how we are supposed to separate the vaginal mucosa from the underlying tissue. So see, the sphincters are torn and they are retracted. That's why we should put the incision vertically on both the side, like butterfly. So to catch the external anal sphincters, they are okay. We are supposed to cut the tissue. So still I have not got the external anal sphincter. So I'm trying to catch the, see. So if when we catch hold of the external anal sphincter, when we remove, it should elevate the posterior aspect of the anus. So then only it is sure the dissection is done on the right side of the patient. So see the thickness of anal mucosa. No perineum is left. Okay, this is how we catch hold of the external anal sphincter. In this, it is impossible to differentiate between external anal sphincter and internal anal sphincter. So this is the separation of external anal sphincter. So now, after this dissection, what we need to do is we should look for the anal mucosa, even in complete perineal tear. So anal mucosa is torn above. It has to be sutured for convenient length. Okay, and then now I'm taking a bite through the external anal sphincter. So ideally 2 or 3 stitches are taken. So usually if it is very thick external anal sphincter, I take 3. Otherwise, I take 2. So for this, preferably I use 30 PDS. Okay, or we can use 3020 Vicryl for this external sphincter. So we should use either 30 PDS or 20 Vicryl. Okay, after closing the external anal sphincter, we are supposed to close the superficial and deep transverse perineal muscles. Can you able to make out that? So we will have after this, even this superficial and deep transverse perineal muscle, they will be apart. Only we will be having vaginal mucosa and anorectal mucosa. In between, we won't be having anything in this case, in this chronic perineal tear. So we have to dissect all the things. After closing the external anal sphincter, we are supposed to close the superficial and deep transverse perineal muscles. So after that, so the perineum will become 4 to 5 centimeter thick between the vaginal mucosa and the anal mucosa. So see, now I have already closed both external anal sphincter and including external and internal anal sphincter, and even the superficial and deep transverse perineum. See, this is one more thing. So I am closing the skin. This is not the perineum, the skin in the perineum. This closing is through the whatever the dissection that we have done laterally. We have to cut on the lateral aspect of the anal canal. Okay, that has come down. So to get the external anal sphincter on either side, that is the rectal mucosa. On either side, still we have that skin gap. So that we are supposed to close. See, that is not the perineum. That is the incision that we have put to get the external anal sphincter. So that area is also be closed separately. Why that is important? This 3rd degree and 4th degree perineal tears, this complete perineal tears, they are known for wound gap. So they are horrible cases. So if we don't repair them properly, they will end up with gap. That is the dreaded complication of this thing. Okay, and one more thing, it is not there in any of the textbook. What I preferably do is, so this PDS, usually what happens when we close both the external anal sphincter end to end, there is a possibility of slipping. So anal mucosa, what happens, the sphincters will be remained at its normal level, but anal mucosa will recede upwards sometimes. I have noticed in few of the cases like that. That's why what modification I am doing in my case is, so go above 1 or 2 centimeter above the anal orifice. You take a bite through the rectal this thing. Rectum will be there, that mucosa. So take a bite through the serosal part of it and attach to the sphincters. So if we do this with the same suture material, when we are using PDS or Vicryl, so with the same suture material, if we attach this, the possibility of slipping of this this thing, sphincters, or migration of the outer margin of the anorectal mucosa will be very less. So this I have adopted off late. By this, this complication can be prevented. So these are few important technical aspects with respect to the repair of this complete perineal tear. So if we identify the sphincters properly, and one more thing is, we can't get 100% of the external anal sphincter tissue while operating. So that is a fact. But we should not miss, at least we should take, we should search and take 80 to 90% of the tissue. So we can't, it is not like something which is easily graspable. It is embedded inside the tissue. So it is preferably, even if we get 80 to 90% of the tissue, it gives 100% this thing, but success rate. So we may get initially, so once we hold it, hardly we will get 30 to 40% of the tissue. So we should catch it, dissect it, and we will get soft lateral to this thing, we will get some soft tissue, okay, fat tissue. So we need to dissect it out, and the complete external anal sphincter, we should grasp it. So if we follow these few tricks, we can able to give 100% success rate. Till date, Yeah. Kirana? Kirana, sure. The next slide. Yeah, that is third degree complete perennial tear. So thank you. I thank all the organizers for giving me this opportunity. I thank Kasturi Madam also. Thank you, one and all.
Okay, thank you, Chandru. Excellent presentation as usual. He is a faculty. He is our old student. He has done a postgraduate in our institute. But for our every PG program, PG teaching program, he is a faculty. He and Kiran. So we are very fond of him. They both are Chandru has done excellent work in urogynecology. He is a pioneer. Now I think you should call Dr. Chandru to hold live workshops, so that because these cases are rare and people PGs are not much exposed to this. So live workshops he can actually show. So so that the benefit is passed on to the patients. So Chandru, you should think of that, doing more and more live workshops with this.
Yes, madam. Surely I will consider and I will do it.
So, any questions?
Yes, ma'am. Questions are there. Dr. Ravikant.
Thank you, Dr. Murthy. It was excellent. Yes.
Thank you, Vidya madam.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the videos were excellent. So we would like to have some live workshop. Because of this corona, we are not able to do that. But I remember you coming to Bijapur and conducting a nice session. Yeah.
Yeah. So shall I take the questions, sir? Dr. Chandrasekhar,
Yeah.
sir?
Yes, madam. Yes,
Yeah.
madam.
So the first question, sir, does OSS suturing cause constipation? What are the chances of fecal incontinence and flatus incontinence after successfully treated OSS? How do you treat or rehabilitate those patients?
Yes, as per the data, the fecal incontinence rate is 5.9%. After the repair, there is a possibility of fecal incontinence of 5.9%. So if it is fecal incontinence, we are supposed to advise her for rehabilitation. So pelvic floor exercise and physiotherapy. Even after that, if it is not subsiding, then we need to opt for the surgery once again. Yes,
okay,
madam.
sir. Yes. So next question we have from Dr. Vidya K. In undiagnosed 4th degree tear and reported 40 hours or later, what are the management options?
I didn't get the question, madam.
If there is a 4th degree tear, sir,
Okay, madam.
the patient reports to you later, or she is delivered somewhere in the periphery.
Yes. Yeah, this happens. Yeah, even then we are supposed to do the surgery even she comes off late. So with broad spectrum antibiotic, we need to do the repair. When compared to the acute injury, the success rate is bit less because already the tissues will be edematous and infection might have been progressed. So in spite of that, we should go ahead with the repair work. There is no need to delay.
Okay, sir. We have Dr. Aruna Nigam, our speaker, who was there for our conference yesterday. So, ma'am is telling the post-operative protocol. When will you allow orally? So, I'll ask one question, sir.
Yes, madam. Yes, madam.
When will you allow orally, sir?
Yeah, usually preferably after, as per this international norm, there is nothing. Once the bowels are open, you can start. Ideally, what I will do in my practice, 3 days or 2 days, I will give oral fluids. From 3rd day, I will start liquids for another 2 days. So by then, for the bowel to come, it takes 4 days. It is more than enough for tissue healing.
Okay, sir. Then to start perineal exercises, as 6 to 8 weeks is very late.
Madam, in this, I will advise the patient once. That's what I told in my this thing. The most one of the most common complication with respect to the repair of this 3rd degree perineal tear is wound dehiscence. Okay, early immobilization we advise. Preferably doing pelvic exercise a pelvic floor exercise should be started once the tissues are healed. Preferably, it is advisable after 12 weeks. So because we need to give the time for tissues to heal. So once the tissues are healed, then we can strengthen them. So before before the tissues are getting healed, if we put more stress on them, there is a possibility of dehiscence of the sutures that we have applied to the sphincters. So early exercises should not be advised, madam.
Okay. When to resume sexual activity?
After 3 months, madam.
Okay. Use of anal ultrasound during follow-up?
Yes, madam, sure. Usually we used to do in our hospital. So it usually ring-like structure, it appears if it is a complete this thing. But with respect to the endoanal ultrasound, the reproducibility and the expertise is very less in most of the countries. Hardly very few people are there to do very good sonology and give interpretation. So that's why still this anorectal, anal sonography and manometry, they are only research this thing, importance. As per green top guidelines, they should not be taken into consideration for the management purpose. Digital examination and thorough examination and visual inspection, they are the better tools rather than sonography.
Okay, sir. So last question. So what is the protocol for follow-up visit, when to call the patient and how long she should come to us for follow-up?
Yes, madam. Ideally, she is supposed to come at 6 weeks and 12 weeks. If not between 6 to 12 weeks, she is supposed to come. Once she comes, we are supposed to assess. By then, we will come to know about her this thing, whether the repair is successful or not. If it is successful, then advise her to go ahead with pelvic floor exercises, and we should advise her the following next pregnancy. What are the things she is supposed to be followed? Okay, if it is if she has got anal incontinence, advise her for pelvic floor exercises. After 6 weeks, if it is not improved, tell her the option of repeat surgery.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, madam.
Thank you for the excellent talk, sir. We are getting many congratulatory messages on this chat box that sir's talk is very excellent.
Thank you, madam. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
So shall we move to Sarita ma'am, because we have to take few questions. Madam has to answer few questions for us. Sarita ma'am?
Yes, I am ready, madam.
Yes,
yeah,
madam.
Before answering the question, can I just show my video?
Yes, ma'am.
Because
Surely,
it is
ma'am.
very important that I can will be able to understand. So I'm just playing my video and the full screen. I just want to mention that this video is prepared by Dr. Just,
ಆ ಪ್ಲಾಸ್ಟಿಕ್ ಚೀಲ ತೆಗೆದು ಒಗಿ ಆಮೇಲೆ ಇವು ಟ್ರಾನ್ಸ್ಫರ್ ಕೈ ವಾಶ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊ ಅದು ತಗೊಂಡಿಲ್ಲ ಅವ್ನ ಕೈಯಾಗಿಂದ
Yeah, I'm sharing this video, which is being prepared by Dr. Poonam from Vardha MGIMS, and she is doing the excellent job there with the PG also doing the thesis on under her. She will just show how they have set up the alternative birthing position room and how they can deliver the baby, and our PGs can understand.
We can't hear the voice, ma'am.
Oh, why? But
But video is very clear, ma'am. Video
can
is very
somebody,
clear.
can
Yeah.
the organizer help me how to make the voice, because I can listen the voice over here. I'm
Ma'am,
not
if you
able
can increase the volume of your
volume is maximum.
And you
on my
can
side.
put your earphones there somewhere. Yeah.
Can you listen now?
Remove the earphone. No,
but
no.
video is very clear, madam. We
Yes.
can see the video, only it's not audible.
But I think the observation may be enough for them, because I'm not able to transmit. This is available in YouTube. Once you just put alternate birthing position MGIMS, one can read.
And this ball is taken out. So this ball is taken out. This is a very simple ball which is available in the gyms, so everyone can get that. Now with this rope, she can hold and she can just reduce her pain whichever way she wants. Now and once she is delivering, she just pushes it here, sits on this, and like that, she can deliver. Now how do you sit for delivery? Can you please tell me? How do you sit for receiving the baby? So usually both of them will sit down, like they will kneel and they will sit, and there are also stools there. These are stools here. You can show them these stools which are available on the chair. So they can be kept here and she can very easily pass the baby here. That's one way clearly how to use her for bar delivery. So this is a bar, very simple bar which anyone can take. And here she sits, so she's just like this and she passes the baby. And if you sit, and we are sitting here and she passes the baby. You can very easily use the baby as well as your part and then take off and tray for this baby. So this is another issue by which women can be delivered. Another method what we are doing is birthing chair. This is what you show her back. She can spread her leg on the side and we sit here like this, and the baby comes out from here. On the lower part you see there is a tray. This tray is covered by a lot of gauze pieces and sterile sheets, and then the baby comes and passes down. She herself can pick up her baby and then put the baby on the breast. So that is what we do. But by making these small stools, we can very easily see, watch, support, and then deliver. So this is also another way of delivery. Lateral position, there is a bed. In this room, if she wants to sit laterally, and then we support the baby from this side. So this can also be done. The most interesting is hydraulic labor. When you see, this was a simple armchair which we have converted into a chair, birthing chair. And if you see, any armchair can be used, but all what you have to do is you have to make it so soft that when the woman sits there, she should not get hurt. And the area which you have to cut should be such that the baby can easily pass out. And the below the tray which is there has to be broad enough so that the whole baby goes in that. And once you cover it with the cotton pieces and the sterile sheet, then it becomes completely sterile. This is what we have done. So it is a simple bath.
The voice is not audible. I can dictate. This is a simple bathtub which is being used for the, which can be simply used for the bathing. The woman lies over in the bathing tub, and there's a cushion is there, and the armrests are here on this side, and this is the tap for the water to come, which is connected to the geyser, and the temperature usually capped is 32 to 38 degrees centigrade or 100 degree Fahrenheit, and the flow of the water can be controlled by the patient herself. And the bathtub is filling up, this tap can be taken out and the water can be drained. Similarly, if you get more amount of the blood, then also this can be drained and the water can be changed very easily. And for this, when woman has to enter into the bathtub, usually the women require a training to be in the bathtub, those who are used to be in the bathtub, or they can be just ask for an initial stage of the labor to be around 1 hour or 2 hours sitting on the bathtub. Sometimes the women doesn't like to take out their clothes when they are the bathtub, so they can just simply use the raincoat sort of the thing, and they can be sitting comfortably. They can have the reading, they can have whatever they want to do, and they can listen the music also if you can give the earphones to them. And the patient sits in this position, and when the patient is delivering, the obstetrician sits on the other edge of the bathtub, and then when the baby is delivering, they are the hands-off technique. When the obstetrician doesn't have to do anything, they just watch the progress of the labor, and the baby is just coming out, they are watching, And once the baby delivers out, the head of the baby should be brought out of the water birth. So the baby should not inhale the water. So look how the obstetrician is sitting over there. The most important, the foot hygiene of the obstetrician needs to be maintained. So she can use a sterile foot covers on the legs like this, and then they can just dip their legs. So there should not be any problem. And this is how you can just help the baby is delivering out, sitting and then observing. And the other way, you can just assist the delivery by giving the support to the perineum, and that you can decide that is a hands-on technique. And the prior counseling is very well important in all these patients. So with this, I end up my video, and I can just proceed further. You can just proceed for the questions.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. Do our chairpersons have to say anything? I'll take the questions after that. Kasturi ma'am, Vidya ma'am, do you want to add to this something?
How they are protect? Just I wanted to know, Sarita, if hello.
Yes, ma'am, you're audible. Yeah.
In water birth, I feel the obstetrician is exposed to some kind of infections if the mother is carrying, because she's into the water can act as a carrier medium.
I described that if the woman is having the infection like a herpes infection and the obvious infection, she may not be allowed for the water birth. But there are other studies where studies for the streptococcal incidence of streptococcal pneumonia in the babies, the risk is not being different from the normal population. And similarly, the other infection risk is also similar as compared to those who were delivered on a non-water birth positions. So the studies has very well reflected there's no increased risk of infection when the patient is delivering the water birth. Of course, the patient with the HIV infection, the herpes infection, they are the contraindication for the water birth.
What about if the woman needs episiotomy?
Episiotomy can be usually in the water birth because of the increased perineal elasticity, and the patient is more comfortable. The effect of the contraction is not there. Episiotomy is not required. If at all required, it can be very well given when she is in the water birth, because she is in the sitting position. At that time, you can give the episiotomies also.
How the sterility of the water is maintained?
That is in the clean water, the simple water can be used, and the lukewarm water is good enough. And the sterility, I just told that women should take a bath and then she should enter into the water bath. And the obstetrician who is dealing with should also be wearing the sterile foot covers, so the water infection will not be there. And of course, the water bath water is allowed to be changed maybe around every 4 hours with the tap which is connected over there in the water bath, which woman herself can regulate.
Okay, yeah.
Ma'am, we have few questions here. Does any using alternate birthing position affect intrapartum monitoring or emergency intervention?
Yes, about the intrapartum monitoring, that is one of the problem. The patient is ambulatory here, so when you put an electronic fetal monitor, they can get displaced, and the risk of non-monitored labor can be there. But in such cases, it is being very well described. The low-risk women, the intermittent auscultation is the best method. And if you're doing the electronic fetal continuous monitoring, it already increases the risk of the cesarean section. So we don't stress much upon the continuous electronic fetal monitoring, but those women who are then high risk and those who actually need the continuous electronic fetal monitoring, the wireless digital applications are available, which can be put on the abdomen of the mother. Mother can be ambulatory, and any displacement the mother herself can control. And in the central monitoring system at the nursing station, the fetal heart rate can be very well monitored. And I describe when the woman is in the water birth also, this waterproof monitors are also available that can be applied on the mother's abdomen. Otherwise, the intermittent monitoring is good enough, and I already described in all these positions, the chances of getting the fetal heart rate variability is much less because the baby gets more oxygen supply due to less compression in the aorta and the IVC, which improves the fetal circulation.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
And about the instrumental delivery, yes, there are certain issues with the instrumental delivery in upright positions. Therefore, if you feel that the patient needs an instrumental delivery, it is always available. The patient can be put on the backline position and where the instruments can be applied very well. But the water birth instrumental delivery can still be carried out.
And do these alternate birthing positions reduce posterior positions?
Yeah, this is all four positions and the left, the line, lateral line position, they have been shown to decrease the risk. They have been shown to correct the occipito-posterior positions. So these are the many of the practice being done. And I think in my own practice, I always ask the women to lie on her opposite side of the back and then improves the occipito-posterior position and corrects and facilitate the rotation of the baby's hand and the chances of vaginal delivery rather than the face to tube delivery.
Answer next speaker. She is messaging. Yes, ma'am. Then can we use these positions in breech delivery also?
Yeah, about the breech delivery, actually, most of the breech delivery they need lots of assistance and care during the second stage of the labor. For the breech delivery, it has been said the women in the first stage of the labor and the early second stage of the labor, what I talked about the passive stage, and till the bearing down effort start, the patient can still be in the comfortable position, whatever she feels, and when she is in the actual active phase of the second stage or about to give the birth, that time the patient can be put on the lithotomy position because that is the most acceptable position for the any of the assisted vaginal deliveries.
Okay. Then Dr. Lohit Kumar is asking, how do we assess the requirement of episiotomy to prevent tears in these positions other than lithotomy? And will these alternate positions reduce the requirement of episiotomy?
Yeah, that is very well described. I have shown the figures also as per the Cochrane review. The women delivering in the upright position, the squatting position, or the kneeling position, the perineum gets widened, and the mothers are more relaxed. The perineum is more stressed, so the chances there's around 20 to 40% reduced incidence of requiring the episiotomies. And another thing is that if you don't give the episiotomy, the risk of tears are always there. So these tears can be first degree and second degree in the most of the position. And the overall, if you look at the intact perineum rate is much less in this alternate birthing position as compared to the standard backline position. And regarding the assessment, when you need the episiotomy, it is exactly the same what you're doing in your backline position because anyhow you have to monitor the progress of the labor as per the partographic principle on these women. And that time you can assess in the second stage of the labor whether the woman needs episiotomy. So it has been shown that some cases of the upright position, especially in the standing position and the lunging position, the risk of perineal tear of the third and fourth degrees are there. So some of the cases has been shown, but the risk is so less. So if the benefits overweighs the disadvantages, then the benefits, it has to be taken into consideration and then they can be repaired because once you identify, as Dr. just now described, you identify immediately, repair, the results are wonderful. So if you're leaving behind an intact perineum in more of the women, still this alternate birthing position can be the choice.
Then last question, ma'am. What are the minimum requirements we should have to use these alternate birthing positions?
Yeah, for this minimum requirement, I think you could not listen the voice in this video which I showed. The first most important thing, you should have a setup that you should have all these like gym balls and the U-cut chairs and the stools and the bathing tub, whatever you need to avoid. And the second thing, and counseling the women during the late third trimester itself. They should be shown all the options that these are the birthing positions available. And you could have seen one protocol book on that, within the every page, each position's advantage and the disadvantage has been very well described. So this can be in the late third trimester, and once again when the patient enters into the labor room, the patient herself and the partner or whoever is the accompanying person, they should be talked about this, discussed, counseling should be done, and the patient preferred position should be taken and then noted down. And after that, once the patient is already in the labor, at that time throughout an assistant should be there who is going to assist her and guide her what to do and how to do and when to do which procedures. So these are the important requirement when you're doing an alternate birthing position. And as I told, that the SCOG says there's no mandatory one prescribed position. So during the labor, throughout the labor, patient women can opt different position. Whichever position gives her the best comfort, they should be promoted, and then she can opt a different position. But of course, at the end, when she's actually delivering, that should be fixed by the women. So there should not be a litigator on, that should be taken on the consent paper.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
I hope I justified the chapter.
Yes,
Thank
ma'am.
you so much. I thoroughly enjoyed being with you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Hello, Dr. Deathubi, madam, it's nice to see you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Dr. Geeta, madam, it's really wonderful being with all.
Thank you, Sarita, ma'am. Now we move on to the next speaker, Dr.